Welcome back to session 3. We're glad that you're able to join us in this way. I want to start our session, Appreciative Assessment, with a question that you see before you. What would we lose if we only engaged in assessment practices that pointed students forward, that allowed students to see how the work they're doing now leads to work they need to do later, and also gives them the opportunity to improve on where they're at and then move forward? To get us started, I encourage you to act in a reflective practice. After I give my instructions, I'm going to ask that you just pause the video to do this important work, because we'll come back to the list that you're going to create later on in the session, and that will allow us to look at our assessment practices. So take 5 minutes now to list all the assessment practices that you engage in as a teacher, as well as those assessment and evaluation practices that you experienced as a student. So I encourage you to pause the video now and take 5 minutes as a group to create the list of assessment practices that you've engaged in and that you've had received or have been done to you as a student. All right, welcome back. I hope you've got a long list. That you've got, I would hope, 10, 15, maybe 20 entries. I can definitely think of a long list as I've engaged in this practice. Before we dig too much into the content, I do want to boldly suggest that we're going to actually try to have 4 learning targets with our time together. I know we've only got an hour together, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to at least touch on or expose these 4 targets as we work together. The first is, I can consider the impact of assessment practices on learning. It sounds simple. But how much time have we spent looking at the tests we give to see how they actually impact student learning? They might record student learning, maybe, if they're a well-done test, but what about their impact on learning that's coming up? So we're going to consider that, the impact of different assessments on learning. The second is, I can consider the impact of assessment practices on relationships. If we believe, as Christian educators, that our faith is communal and that we are created for interdependence, to depend on each other, to take care of each other as well as ourselves, then our assessment practice should align with that. So we're talking the teacher-student relationship, but we're also talking peer-to-peer relationship. So we want to consider the assessment practices we use through the lens of relationship building or relationship breaking. Third, and you've begun this target already before I even shared the learning targets, is I can inventory and discern my present assessment practices. And you've begun that work already by creating a list of all the assessment practices you use in the classroom. And lastly, I can choose assessment practices based on, or practices with a focus on specific results, where we have a desired result and we're choosing an assessment practice that aligns with that desired result, rather than, I would argue, doing the same thing the same way without thinking about this. But I get ahead of myself. So 4 bold targets with only 60 minutes together, a lot of that time being actually work time. But I believe that we can at least begin to engage with all 4 of these learning targets in our time together. So I think it's important to realize that assessment should actually look different in the Christian school. Christian schools have a specific mission. They have a specific vision for who they want their students to become. And assessment plays a big role in forming students. So if we are not choosing our assessment practices with our mission and vision in mind, there's a pretty good chance that we're actually supporting the formation of students in a direction that is counter to what our hopes and goals are as a school. So with that in mind, I'd like to suggest for Christian schools, we need to, as much as possible, be engaged in appreciative assessment. And by appreciative assessment, what we're talking about is assessment practices that help students find and build their unique abilities their aptitudes, and we do that by providing positive, supportive feedback. Sounds simple, but in many regards, our present assessment practices have a tendency to be counterintuitive if this is our definition and this is our goal. The reason appreciative assessment fits in the Christian school is first and foremost its formational impact. And I encourage you to look at the list of assessments you made through the lens of image bearing. If we believe that each student that comes through the doors of our school and each parent who comes through the doors of our school is an image bearer of the one true God, then we need to keep that in mind in how we approach assessment. Do we continue to engage in practices that rank students? Do we engage in practices that send students in specific groups based on their academic ability? We need to consider whether that helps form students in their faith. We also assume that our assessment practices actually promote learning. But I don't want to make that assumption today. I want to encourage you to look at your assessment practices through the lens of learning. Does this practice, this test, this quiz, this poster board, this presentation, whatever it might be, give students the opportunity to improve, grow, and take ownership of their learning? If our assessment practices include one opportunity to be measured and then we move on, we are actually not interested in learning at that stage. We're interested in achievement rather than growth. And most of our school missions, don't include achievement. If they do include learning goals, it is about learning or it is about growth. It's not about being best in comparison to our classmates. And then lastly, it's important to check to make sure that the work we do in assessment and how we're communicating learning does fit and comply with the Ministry of Education. But I would like to argue that if we are taking care of those first two questions, the third one will take care of itself. Now, what I'm asking is for us to consider changes to assessment. And we know in the province of British Columbia that the new reporting and communication of learning policy is on its way, and that there will be changes coming to the school. And when we think about change, and we think about changes to assessment in our practices, and maybe a few people that are questioning that traditional unit test and the value of it with the modernized curriculum, I'd like you to think about which of these squirrels represents how you're feeling today. And what I encourage you to consider as you look at these pictures is, where are you on this scale? And then secondly, where is your school on this scale? And I encourage you to take a few minutes now, first to think on your own. Secondly, once you've had a few minutes to think, pair up with someone else that's showing you with their body language that they're ready to talk about it. And then lastly, as a whole group, if you're in a whole group staff situation, as a whole group, answer these questions collectively. Which squirrel best represents how you're feeling about changes to assessment in the province of British Columbia? And where's your school at with this? And why did you choose the picture you chose? So take 10 minutes now to have that conversation. All right, welcome back. I know for me, as I look at these squirrel pictures, I have moments in many of the squirrel pictures, but at this stage now, as someone who did not succeed well in traditional schooling, I look at squirrel 8 and think this is where many of us need to be. But ultimately, there are a lot of times on a Friday afternoon where I'm feeling more like squirrel 4 or maybe squirrel 5. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we can be in different places as we go on this journey, but that we need to engage in a process that actually improves our assessment practices. And I need to acknowledge that this is a messy thing. but you need to hang in there. There is going to be mistakes. We've heard about the implementation gap as you start new things. There's always a dip in productivity, and it's at that time you need to be convinced to continue to move forward. It will be different for students, different for parents, and different for you. But as we do a better job of our thinking about our assessment practices, we will have the opportunity to be more faithful in stewarding the lives, the impact we have on the lives of students. So we're going to engage in a risk-free assessment. I want you to think about all the assessment practices you've presently used or used. This is work you've done already. And you're using the list that you started at the beginning of this session. And we're actually going to sort your list. So we're going to sort your list in 3 ways. The first way is I would like you to go down your list. And I want you to do this with a partner so that you can check with the other person if you're wondering about which category it fits in. And so you can be prepared that if you say, oh, this fits in this category, you need to be able to give a rationale to your partner whose job will be to be an advocate for a different perspective so that you can clarify with evidence why you think this assessment practice fits. So the first thing we want to do is you want to put a negative sign or a dash beside the practices that would be categorized as done for students. So assessment practices where all the work is actually yours or appears that it's done for students. So I want you to go down your list and read each one, picture it in your mind and go, is this done for students? And if it is, just put a little dash beside it. So take a few minutes now to put a dash beside each of the assessment practices that are done for students. Take some time to do that now. Great. Hopefully you've had time to look at your list through that lens. Here's your second lens. I would like you to go through all the different types of assessment practices. And this time, you're going to look through it with a lens of doing with students. So what are the assessment practices that you do with students? And just put a little plus sign by each of those. You might find that there's going to be some assessment practices that might have both, depending on how it's done. Have that conversation with your partner to clarify and ensure that that is the case. But go through your list, putting a plus sign by each of the assessment practices that are done with students. Take the time to do that now. Welcome back. I know your list of assessment practices is getting a little bit messier here, but we do have one more category. Same practice as before, but this time put a number sign beside the practices that would be categorized as to students. Assessment practices that are done to students. There's probably a few less of these maybe, but have that conversation. Go through the list first on your own and then with your partner, putting a number sign beside any of the assessment practices that are done to students. Take time to do that now. All right, for your type A's, I know I've just asked you, you've made a nice list in your notebook, and now I've asked you to mess it up with all kinds of signs and symbols, and it's not looking as good as you'd like. But I would like, again, to really continue with this list and look at it through the lens, a few lenses that reinforce appreciative assessment. So as we think about deepening our assessment practices and choosing one or two things we can do as a teacher next week to improve our assessment practices at our school, what I want you to do again, and we're taking a different lens now to look through our list, highlight what assessment practices highlight what students are able to do. So they don't highlight what students aren't able to do, and we all know that if given the choice, we're going to actually emphasize on the negative rather than the positive. So what are the assessment practices that focus on the positive? Go through your list, making a mark, for the ones that highlight what students are able to do. Again, with the same voice, what gives students a voice in the assessment process? Circle the assessment practices that give students a voice. Take time to do that now. All right, let's keep going. What about the assessment practices that are student-driven, where students are actually in charge of the assessment practice and invite you in as part of the process? What assessment practices do you have that are student-motivated, student-driven, because they know what learning they would like to do? What about assessment practices that you can see directly aligned to your mission, or directly aligned to the tagline you have for the school? For example, for us, as an organization at SCSBC, we talk about service, community, advocacy, and vision. And if those are our 4 areas that we're going to focus on, we're going to choose assessment practices that measure whether we do a good job of service, or of advocacy, or community. And we might not do an assessment practice that focuses on content acquisition, because that's not what we're about as an organization. So spend some time looking at your assessment practices through the, as a match for the mission and vision of your school. And now an important one. I want you to take some time looking at which of the assessment practices on your list, in your portfolio of assessment practices, help build relationships. Either relationships with you as the educator with your student, or between students, maybe between the student and the parent. There are many important relationships in the lives of our students, and we want our assessment practices to foster the building of community, to create a community of interdependence rather than independence and personal achievement. And our assessment practices should point in that direction. What about peer-to-peer? And that's connected to our previous one. And that promote continued learning. Each of our assessment practices should be viewed through these lenses. What about learning targets? Are our assessment practices directly connected to the type of learning target that we have established for our class? Obviously, if you're not using learning targets, it's pretty hard to design an assessment that's connected to the learning target. But once you're effectively using learning targets, though that needs to be a different presentation because we don't have enough time today, once you're using a learning target, it's much easier to focus an assessment around a desired result. So this is a long list. You might not be able to have each of these elements in each of the assessment practices you do. But I'm hoping this list becomes a filter to help you improve the type of assessments you're doing. Now let's talk about what's not highlighted. Are there any things on your list that don't have a highlight from this list? They only have a plus, a minus, or a number sign? Spend some time first in quiet reflection, and then when you decide the people around you are ready to talk as well, pair and then share as a large group. What assessment practices do you engage in that actually don't support any of these things we've just talked about? Have a conversation about, do they still have value? Can you identify a pattern in the ones that didn't get highlighted? Do they actually bring value to the learning experience, or are they only in place to justify achievement indicators that we as teachers feel like we need to have to justify our existence? This is the A list. It comes from a list of learning leaders in SCSBC circles who have done some deep thinking about assessment and have come up with this list to help us improve our assessment practices. If we're engaging in an assessment practice that doesn't align with at least one of these bullets, we need to evaluate whether it's an assessment practice, we should still continue. And I'm not suggesting that everything we do is wrong and we need to start again. On the contrary, I would like to suggest that many of our practices are close to where we need to be. And it's with a conscious adjustment or switch or small check, like organizing the questions in a math test around learning targets rather than just randomly listing them. That gives both the student and the teacher knowledge and power around learning that isn't in place if you're not organizing your test around learning targets. So I want to take some time just to affirm good practice already taking place in schools and some realizations about what still needs to happen. So the first thing I want you to do in your small groups is to make a list of assessment practices that you're already doing well in your school. Take 5 minutes to have a conversation about which assessment practices are being done well in your school and why you're confident that they are done well. And I'll meet you back here in 5 minutes. All right, I hope that was a fruitful conversation. What about this one? Where do you as a school need to see growth? Again, we're having a great conversation here. Take this time to imagine, where do we need to see growth? And if you've got a list that's a mile long, don't be depressed. Look at your list and think to yourself, if we only made one change, which of these changes would have the greatest impact on student learning? And commit to that one change. Take 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to have that conversation as a group. All right, I trust that that conversation was fruitful and that you've got one or two things that you can focus on as you move forward. Now, I remember being on the other side of the camera at teachers' conventions and realizing if the presenter doesn't give me something tangible that I can do on Monday, maybe I've wasted my time. And though I'd argue with that sentiment, because sometimes we just need to grow intellectually and we might not get something practical, I also know that if we're going to talk assessment, I need to ensure that I'm suggesting a tool, something practical that you can engage with. And in my latest stint in the classroom last spring, one of the ways that I really wanted to step towards assessment innovation was in math. And I just want to share with you a simple tool that transformed how we did math skills in class. So what you see before you is a learning target sheet that we used in class. At the beginning of a unit, I would give students two things. I would give them a sampling of the type of questions we were going to have at the end of unit assessment, and I would give them a learning target sheet that highlighted all the learning targets we're going to focus on in that unit, and space for them to fill out their progress towards that learning target. So I'm teaching 7th graders, so they are fairly autonomous learners on the right day. If it's not Friday afternoon or Monday morning or Wednesday in the middle of the day, they're fairly autonomous, focused learners. And what I said to them was, each of these targets is something that we think is important enough that we're going to assess along the way, but also at the end. And the carrot I gave them was that if you've already shown mastery of this specific skill before the unit test, for example, or before the final assessment, you don't have to actually do that section of the test. So in order to live into that, I need to arrange my math test according to learning target. And students would fill out this sheet as we worked on the different targets. And if they have showed mastery, and by mastery I defined consistent accuracy in a variety of situations. That was my definition of mastery for for 7th graders. So consistent application in a variety of situations. And we talked about what that looked like, how that went. And I would have a learning target as part of my math assignment. We would do the work, and then before we moved on, students would go back to their learning target sheet, find the learning target, and then assess by themselves how did they do, what was the name of the task, what was easy, what was difficult, and what goal they had next time. And if they were able to have successfully complete the task 3 times before the end of term or the end of unit assessment, they didn't have to complete that part of the test. So that meant at the end of the term, there was plenty of students who only had 1 or 2 sections of the test to do. And this was a way for them to own their learning, because why would we need to test a child if we already know they've shown mastery? By dividing our assessments by learning target, we allow students to get off the hamster wheel and just engage with the parts of learning they need to engage in. And what I got to see is it didn't take long for students to get a hold of a tool like this and get excited about the fact that they can see their progress, they can see their growth, and they're actually rewarded for hard work by not having to do this test that they already know they're going to do well on, and they might not get 100% because they might do one sort of small computational error. Have a conversation now in your small groups. What would students have to learn to be able to use a tool like this? What would the teacher have to learn and be willing to do, or willing to let go, to use a tool like this? I've got some ideas about that. But have that conversation in your small groups first. These 2 questions again. What would students have to learn to be able to use a tool like this successfully? And secondly, what would the teacher have to learn or be willing to let go of to use a tool like this successfully? Take 5 or 10 minutes to have that conversation. I trust that you've had a great conversation. I found this to transform what learning looked like in my math class. It motivated students, gave them a high level of autonomy, and when I didn't necessarily disagree, it led to learning conversations. Can you show me this assignment again? How did you show mastery? Those sort of questions. So our conversations became learning conversations rather than what did you get conversations or achievement conversations. And to me, that is what teaching should be about, is about learning conversations, not clarifying did I get 97 or 95%. But have you shown mastery? How do you know? How can you confidently say that you have? Changes like this are exciting because they move us closer to where we should be as Christian schools. But changes like these are also a challenge. In order to meet the objectives of changing assessment practices, you need to create an assessment collective. Who are the people in your school that are willing to take the risks with you to build better assessment practices that point students forward in their learning? Who needs to be around your table dreaming about this at your school? How are you going to make it happen? Who on your present staff can you share these thoughts with or this presentation with? Who on your staff already demonstrates innovative and exciting assessment practices? Who on your staff might not be demonstrating innovative practices, but has shown a willingness to learn and grow as an educator? Identify who would be in your corner. Which administrator will support you on this journey? Do you need a collaborative partner? If you came alone to this session and found all my discussion times awkward, Who should you review these ideas with? Invite them to coffee and say, let's talk assessment. This is not a journey for the faint of heart. Students will ask questions, though the only ones I find that really ask the questions about where's the ABC gone are your A students. Students who are regularly getting B's and C's are delighted that we're not talking letter grade ranking anymore. It's only the A students that miss it because they want that exterior motivation. You need to have a collective to move this forward because you'll have parents asking questions, you'll have students asking questions, and you'll even have your own questions yourself. And it's important to realize that you need to have someone with you walking this journey with you. If you can't find someone in your own school, no problem. Reach out to me. I can connect you with other schools who are on this journey. If we were together, I would have us all form up into a circle to close out our time together. And I want to end where I began. What would we lose if we only engaged in assessment practices that pointed students forward? We would have to let go of things. Maybe some of our ego. Maybe we'd have to release some fear about what if parents ask questions about what grade I've given. Maybe we'd have to unlearn practices that were done to us and now we're doing to students. But I would like to argue that schools are about learning first, foremost, and in the end. And that what we would lose is a lot of the archaic industrial system, which is exactly what we've been fighting against for decades. And what we would gain in terms of learning, in terms of learning culture, in terms of student autonomy and development, far outweighs any of the comfort we might lose by choosing a new practice. I hope you found this conversation with colleagues and what I've brought today to be helpful. Most of you know where to find me. My mugshot is on the sesbc.ca website, and my email is there as well. You can also find me on Twitter at @dspyksma, @DSPYKSMA on Twitter. I'm on Twitter daily as part of my Ed Thought of the Day. So feel free to send me a direct message on Twitter, and we can connect to talk assessment that way as well. Thank you for your time and attention in the lives of students. Have a great day.